Section 7 of Reminiscences of Captain Gro. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Reminiscences of Captain Gro by Captain Rhys Howell Gronow. The Faubourg Saint-Germain. The distinguishing characteristics of the residents of the noble Faubourg, as it was called at the time I am speaking of, were indomitable pride and exclusiveness, with a narrow-minded ignorance of all beyond the circle in which its members moved. In our day of comparative equality and general civility, no one who has not arrived at my age and lived in Paris can form any idea of the insolence and hauteur of the higher classes of society in 1815. The glance of unutterable disdain which the painted old Duchess of the Restoration cast upon the youthful belles of the Chaussée d'Antin, or the handsome widows of Napoleon's army of heroes, defies description. Although often responded to by a sarcastic sneer at the antediluvian charms of the émigré, yet the look of contempt and disgust often sank deep into the victim's heart, leaving there germs which showed themselves 15 years later in the Revolution of 1830. In those days this privileged class was surrounded by a charmed circle, which no one could by any means break through. Neither personal attractions nor mental qualifications formed a passport into that exclusive society, to enter which the small nobility of the provinces, or the nouveaux riches, sighed in vain. It would have been easier for a young guardsman to make his way into the Convent des Oiseaux, the fashionable convent in Paris, than for any of these parvenus to force an entrance into the Faubourg Saint-Germain. One of the first acts which followed the restoration of the Bourbons was the grant of a pecuniary indemnity amounting to 1 milliard, or 40 millions sterling, to be distributed amongst the émigrés who had lost fortunes or estates by their devotion to the royal family. They had now, therefore, the means of receiving their friends, political partisans, and foreigners with more than usual splendour, and it must be admitted that those who were thought worthy to be received were treated like spoiled children, and petted and flattered to their hearts' content. In their own houses they were really des grands seigneurs, and quite incapable of treating their invited guests with the insolence that became the fashion among the Jewish parvenus during the reign of the citizen king. It is one thing to disdain those whom one does not think worthy of our acquaintance, and another to insult those whom one has thought proper to invite. In their own houses, the inhabitants of the Faubourg Saint-Germain were scrupulously polite. Even if some enterprising foreigner should have got in surreptitiously, as long as he was under his host's roof, he was treated with perfect courtesy, though ignominiously cut for the remainder of his days. All this was not very amiable, but the inhabitants of the noble Faubourg were never distinguished for their amiability. Their best characteristics were the undaunted courage with which they met death upon the scaffold, and the cheerfulness and resignation with which they ate the bitter bread of exile. In general, les grandes dames were not remarkable for their personal attractions, nor for the elegance of their appearance or dress. The galaxy of handsome women that formed the court of the emperor had perhaps sent beauty somewhat out of fashion, for the high-born ladies who took their place were what we should call dowdy, and had nothing distinguished in their appearance. Many of those who belonged to the most ancient families were almost vulgar in outward form and feature. Their manner had a peculiar, off-hand, easy style, and they particularly excelled in setting down any unlucky person who had happened to offend them. Their main object at this time was to stand well at court, therefore they adapted themselves to circumstances, and could be devout with the Dauphine and sceptical with Louis XVIII. The men of the aristocracy of the Revolution were less clever and satirical than the women; but, on the other hand, they had far more of the distinguished bearing and graceful urbanity of the grands seigneurs of the olden time. The émigré nobles would have gazed with unutterable horror at their degenerate descendants of the present day. But these young booted, bearded, cigar-smoking scions of la jeune France would have run round their courteous, but perhaps rather slow ancestors in all the details of daily life. The principal houses of reception in those days were those of the Montmorency, the Richelieu, Biron, Rohan, Goutot-Talleyrand, Beaufremont, Luxembourg, Crillon, Choiseul, Chabot, Fitzjames, Gramont, La Tour de Pin, Coislin, and Mailly. Most of these mansions are now occupied as public offices, or Jesuitical schools, or by foreign ministers. Those who are now supposed to be the great people of the Faubourg Saint-Germain are nothing more than actors, who put on a motley dress and appear before the public with the view of attracting that attention to which they are not entitled. It is therefore an error to suppose that the modern Faubourg is anything like what it was during the days of the Bourbons. At the present moment, the only practical aid the inhabitants of this locality can accord to the legitimist cause in Europe is by getting up subscriptions for the papacy and such exiled sovereigns as Francis II. And in order to do so, they generally address themselves to married women and widows. In fact, it is from the purses of susceptible females, many of whom are English, that donations are obtained for legitimacy and popery in distress. It is to be regretted that the most renowned and ancient families of France have, in society and politics, yielded their places to another class. That refinement of perception, sensitiveness, and gentle bearing, which take 3 or 4 generations to produce, are no longer the characteristics of Parisian society. The gilded saloons of the Tuileries, and those magnificent hotels whose architects have not been geniuses of art, but the children of Mammon, are occupied by the Jew speculator, the political parasite, the clever schemer, and those who, whilst following the fortune of the great man who rules France, are nothing better than harpies. Most of these pretended devotees of imperialism have, speaking figuratively, their portmanteaus perpetually packed, ready for flight. The Emperor's good nature, as regards his entourage, has never allowed him to get rid of men who, perhaps, ought not to be seen so near the imperial throne of France. The weakest feature of Napoleon III's government is the conspicuous presence of a few persons in high places, whose cupidity is so extravagant that, in order to gratify their lust of wealth, they would not hesitate, indirectly at least, to risk a slur on the reputation of their master and benefactor, in order to gain their own ends. The Salon des Étrangers in Paris. When the Allies entered Paris after the Battle of Waterloo, the English gentlemen sought instinctively something like a club. Paris, however, possessed nothing of the sort, but there was a much more dangerous establishment than the London clubs, namely a rendezvous for confirmed gamblers. The Salon des Étrangers was most gorgeously furnished, provided with an excellent kitchen and wines, and was conducted by the celebrated Marquis de Livry, who received the guests and did the honours with a courtesy which made him famous throughout Europe. The Marquis presented an extraordinary likeness to the Prince Regent of England, who actually sent Lord Fife over to Paris to ascertain this momentous fact. The play which took place in these saloons was frequently of the most reckless character. Large fortunes were often lost, the losers disappearing, never more to be heard of. Amongst the English habitués were the Honourable George T, the late Henry Baring, Lord Thanet, Tom Sowerby, Cuthbert, Mr. Steer, Henry Broadwood, and Bob Arnold. The Honourable George T., who used to arrive from London with a very considerable letter of credit, expressly to try his luck at the Salon des Étrangers, at length contrived to lose his last shilling at rouge et noir. When he had lost everything he possessed in the world, he got up and exclaimed in an excited manner, "If I had Canova's Venus and Adonis from Alton Towers, my uncle's country seat, it should be placed on the rouge, for black has won 14 times running." The late Henry Baring was more fortunate at hazard than his countryman, but his love of gambling was the cause of his being excluded from the banking establishment. Colonel Sowerby of the Guards was one of the most inveterate players in Paris, and, as is frequently the case with a fair player, a considerable loser. But perhaps the most incurable gamester amongst the English was Lord Thanet, whose income was not less than £50,000 a year, every farthing of which he lost at play. Cuthbert dissipated the whole of his fortune in like manner. In fact, I do not remember any instance where those who spent their time in this den did not lose all they possessed. The Marquis de L had a charming villa at Romainville, near Paris, to which, on Sundays, he invited not only those gentlemen who were the most prodigal patrons of his salon, but a number of ladies who were dancers and singers conspicuous at the opera, forming a society of the strangest character, the male portion of which were bent on losing their money, whilst the ladies were determined to get rid of whatever virtue they might still have left. The dinners on these occasions were supplied by the chef of the Salon des Étrangers, and were such as few renommés of the kitchens of France could place upon the table. Amongst the constant guests was Lord Fife, the intimate friend of George IV., with Mademoiselle Noblet, a danseuse, who gave so much satisfaction to the habitués of the pit at the opera, both in Paris and London. His lordship spent a fortune upon her. His presents in jewels, furniture, articles of dress, and money exceeded £40,000. In return for all this generosity, Lord Fife asked nothing more than the ladies' flattery and professions of affection. Paul Standish was always to be seen in this circle, and his own hotel in the Rue Le Pelletier was often lighted up, and fêtes given to the theatrical and demi-monde. Standish died in Spain, leaving his gallery of pictures to Louis Philippe. Amongst others who visited the Salon des Étrangers were Sir Francis Vincent, Gooch, Green, Ball Hughes, and many others whose names I no longer remember. Of foreigners, the most conspicuous were Blücher, General Ormano, father-in-law of Count Walewski, Pacto, and Clary, as well as most of the ambassadors at the court of the Tuileries. As at Crockford's, a magnificent supper was provided every night for all who thought proper to avail themselves of it. The games principally played were rouge et noir and hazard, the former producing an immense profit, for not only were the whole of the expenses of this costly establishment defrayed by the winnings of the bank, but a very large sum was paid annually to the municipality of Paris. I recollect a young Irishman, Mr. Goff, losing a large fortune at this tapis vert. After returning home about 2 a.m., he sat down and wrote a letter, giving reasons as to why he was about to commit suicide. These, it is needless to say, were simply his gambling reverses. A pistol shot through the brain terminated his existence. Sir Francis Vincent, a man of old family and considerable fortune, was another victim of this French hell, who contrived to get rid of his magnificent property, and then disappeared from society. In calling up my recollections of the Salon des Étrangers, some 40 years since, I see before me the noble form and face of the Hungarian Count Hunyadi, the chief gambler of the day, who created considerable sensation in his time. He became très à la mode. His horses, carriage, and house were considered perfect, while his good looks were the theme of universal admiration. There were ladies' cloaks à la Hunyade, whilst the illustrious Borel of the Rocher de Cancaille named new dishes after the famous Hungarian. Hunyadi's luck for a long time was prodigious. No bank could resist his attacks, and at one time he must have been a winner of nearly 2 millions of francs. His manners were particularly calm and gentlemanlike. He sat apparently unmoved, with his right hand in the breast of his coat, whilst thousands depended upon the turning of a card or the hazard of a die. His valet, however, confided to some indiscreet friend that his nerves were not of such iron temper as he would have made people believe, and that the Count bore in the morning the bloody marks of his nails, which he had pressed into his chest in the agony of an unsuccessful turn of fortune. The streets of Paris were at that time not very safe, consequently the Count was usually attended to his residence by 2 gendarmes, in order to prevent his being attacked by robbers. Hunyadi was not wise enough, what gamblers are, to leave Paris with his large winnings, but continued as usual to play day and night. A run of bad luck set in against him, and he lost not only the whole of the money he had won, but a very large portion of his own fortune. He actually borrowed £50 of the well-known Tommy Garth, who was himself generally more in the borrowing than the lending line, to take him back to Hungary. The Duchess de Berry at Mass at the Chapelle Royale. I had the honour of being invited to an evening party at the Tuileries in the winter of 1816, and was in conversation with the Comtesse de l'Espinasse, when the Duchess did me the honour to ask me if I intended going to Saint Germain to hunt. I replied in the negative, not having received an invitation; upon which the Duchess graciously observed that if I would attend Mass the following morning in the Royal Chapel, she would manage it. Accordingly, I presented myself there, dressed in a black coat and trousers and white neckcloth. But at the entrance a huge Swiss told me I could not enter the chapel without knee-buckles. At that moment Alexandre Gérardin, the grand veneur, came to my assistance. He spoke to the Duchess, who immediately gave instructions that Mr. Gronow was to be admitted sans culotte. The card for the hunt came, but the time to get the uniform was so short that I was prevented going to Saint Germain. At that time the fascinating Duchess de Berry was the theme of admiration of every one. All who could obtain admission to the chapelle were charmed with the grace with which, on passing through the happy group who had been fortunate enough to gain the privilege, she cast her glance of recognition upon those who were honoured with her notice. When again I had the honour of being in the presence of the Duchess, she inquired whether the hunt amused me, and upon my telling her that I had been unable to go, in consequence of the want of the required uniform, the Duchess archly remarked, "Ah, Monsieur le Capitaine, parce que vous n'avez pas jamais des culottes." Lord Westmoreland. When I was presented at the court of Louis XVIII, Lord Westmoreland, the grandfather of the present lord, accompanied Sir Charles Stuart to the Tuileries. On our arrival in the room where the king was, we formed ourselves into a circle, when the king good-naturedly inquired after Lady Westmoreland, from whom his lordship was divorced, and whether she was in Paris. Upon this the noble lord looked sullen, and refused to reply to the question put by the king. His Majesty, however, repeated it, when Lord Westmoreland hallooed out in bad French, "Je ne sais pas, je ne sais pas, je ne sais pas." Louis, rising, said, "Assez, milord, assez, milord." On one occasion, Lord Westmoreland, who was Lord Privy Seal, being asked what office he held, replied, "Le chancelier et le grand sot, SCEAU, in brackets, SOT. Moi, je suis le petit sot d'Angleterre." On another occasion he wished to say, "I would if I could, but I can't," and rendered it, "Je voudrais si je coudrais, mais je ne canais pas." Alderman Wood. Among the many English who then visited Paris was Alderman Wood, who had previously filled the office of Lord Mayor of London. He ordered 100 visiting cards, inscribing upon them, "Alderman Wood, feu Lord Mayor de Londres," which he had largely distributed amongst people of rank, having translated the word late into feu, which I need hardly state means dead. The Opera. A few years after the restoration of the Bourbons, the Opera was the grand resort of all the fashionable world. Sosten de la Rochefoucauld was Minister of the Household, and his office placed him at the head of all the theatres. Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld was exceedingly polite to our countrymen, and gave permission to most of our dandies to go behind the scenes, where Bigottini, Fanny Bias, Vestris, Anatole, Paul, Albert, and the other principal dancers congregated. One of our countrymen, having been introduced by Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld to Mademoiselle Bigottini, the beautiful and graceful dancer, in the course of conversation with this gentleman, asked him in what part of the theatre he was placed; upon which he replied, "Mademoiselle, dans un loge rôti," instead of grillé. The lady could not understand what he meant, until his introducer explained the mistake, observing, "Les diables des Anglais pensent toujours à leur roast-beef." Fanny Ellsler. In 1822 I saw this beautiful person for the first time. She was originally one of the figurantes at the opera at Vienna, and was at this time about 14 years of age, and of delicate and graceful proportions. Her hair was auburn, her eyes blue and large, and her face wore an expression of great tenderness. Some years after, the Duke of Reichstadt, the son of the great Napoleon, was captivated with her beauty. In a word, he became her acknowledged admirer, while her marvellous acting and dancing drew around her all the great men of the German court. The year following she went to Naples, where a brother of the king fell desperately in love with her. Mademoiselle Ellsler went soon afterwards to Paris, where her wit electrified all the fashionable world, and her dancing and acting in the Diable Boiteux made the fortune of the entrepreneur. In London her success was not so striking, but her cachucha will long be remembered as one of the most exquisite exhibitions of female grace and power ever seen at Her Majesty's Theatre. And in expressiveness her pantomimic powers were unrivalled. Charles X. and Louis Philippe. When the father of the present ex-King of Naples came to Paris during the reign of Charles X, Louis Philippe, then Duke of Orleans, living at the Palais Royal, gave a very grand fete to his royal cousin. I had the honour to be one of the party invited, and witnessed an extraordinary scene, which I think worth relating. About 11 o'clock, when the rooms were crowded, Charles X arrived with a numerous suite. On entering, he let fall his pocket handkerchief; it was then supposed by accident. Upon this, Louis Philippe fell upon one knee and presented the handkerchief to his sovereign, who smiled and said, "Merci, mon cher, merci." This incident was commented upon for many days, and several persons said that the handkerchief was purposely thrown down to see whether Louis Philippe would pick it up. At that period the Orleans family were en mauvaise odeur at the Tuileries, and consequently this little incident created considerable gossip among the courtly quidnuncs. I remember that when Lord William Bentinck was asked what he thought of the circumstance, he good-naturedly answered, The king most probably wanted to know how the wind blew. It was known that a large number of persons hostile to the court were invited, and among these were Casimir Perier, the Dupin, Lafitte, Benjamin Constant, and a host of others, who a few years afterwards drove out the eldest branch that occupied the throne to make way for Louis Philippe. Lord Thanet. The late Lord Thanet, celebrated for having been imprisoned in the Tower for his supposed predilection for republicanism, passed much of his time in Paris, particularly at the Salon des Étrangers. His lordship's infatuation for play was such that when the gambling tables were closed, he invited those who remained to play at chicken hazard and écarté. The consequence was that one night he left off a loser of £120,000. When told of his folly and the probability of his having been cheated, he exclaimed, "Then I consider myself lucky in not having lost twice that sum." Lord Granville, the British ambassador. Soon after Lord Granville's appointment, a strange occurrence took place at one of the public gambling houses. A colonel, on half pay, in the British service, having lost every farthing that he possessed, determined to destroy himself, together with all those who were instrumental in his ruin. Accordingly, he placed a canister full of fulminating powder under the table, and set it on fire. It blew up, but fortunately no one was hurt. The police arrested the colonel and placed him in prison. He was, however, through the humane interposition of our ambassador, sent out of France as a madman. Marshal Blucher. Marshal Blucher, though a very fine fellow, was a very rough diamond, with the manners of a common soldier. On his arrival in Paris, he went every day to the Salon, and played the highest stakes at rouge et noir. The Salon, during the time that the Marshal remained in Paris, was crowded by persons who came to see him play. His manner of playing was anything but gentlemanlike, and when he lost, he used to swear in German at everything that was French, looking daggers at the croupier. He generally managed to lose all he had about him, also all the money his servant, who was waiting in the antechamber, carried. I recollect looking attentively at the manner in which he played. He would put his right hand into his pocket, and bring out several rouleaux of Napoleons, and throw them on the red or black. If he won the first coup, he would allow it to remain, but when the croupier stated that the table was not responsible for more than 10,000 francs, then Blucher would roar like a lion, and rap out oaths in his native language, which would doubtless have met with great success at Billingsgate, if duly translated. Fortunately, they were not heeded, as they were not understood by the lookers-on. At that period there were rumours, and reliable ones too, that Blucher and the Duke of Wellington were at loggerheads. The Prussians wanted to blow up the bridge of Jena, but the Duke sent a battalion of our regiment to prevent it, and the Prussian engineers who were mining the bridge were civilly sent away. This circumstance created some ill will between the chiefs. A sort of congress of the Emperors of Austria and Russia and the King of Prussia, with Blucher and Wellington, met at the Hotel of Foreign Affairs on the Boulevard, when, after much ado, the Duke of Wellington emphatically declared that if any of the monuments were destroyed, he would take the British army from Paris. This threat had the desired effect. Nevertheless, Blucher levied contributions on the poor Parisians, and his army was newly clothed. The Bank of France was called upon to furnish him with several £1,000s, which, it was said, were to reimburse him for the money lost at play. This, with many other instances of extortion and tyranny, was the cause of Blucher's removal, and he took his departure by order of the king. I once saw a regiment of Prussians march down the Rue Saint-Honoré, when a line of half a dozen hackney coachmen were quietly endeavouring to make their way in a contrary direction. Suddenly some of the Prussian soldiers left their ranks, and with the butt end of their muskets knocked the poor coachmen off their seats. I was in uniform, and felt naturally ashamed at what I had seen. Some Frenchmen came up to me and requested me to report what I had witnessed to the Duke of Wellington; but upon my telling them it would be of no avail, they one and all said the English ought to blush at having allies and friends capable of such wanton brutality. The fact is that the French had behaved so ill at Berlin, after the Battle of Jena in 1806, that the Prussians had sworn to be revenged, if ever they had the opportunity to visit upon France the cruelties, the extortion, insults, and hard usage their own capital had suffered. And they kept their word. One afternoon, when upwards of 100 Prussian officers entered the galleries of the Palais Royal, they visited all the shops in turn, insulting the women and striking the men, breaking the windows and turning everything upside down. Nothing, indeed, could have been more outrageous than their conduct. When information was brought to Lord James Hay of what was going on, he went out, and arrived just as a troop of French gendarmes were on the point of charging the Prussians, then in the garden. He lost no time in calling out his men, and placing himself between the gendarmes and the officers, said he should fire upon the first who moved. The Prussians then came to him and said, "We had all vowed to return upon the heads of the French in Paris the insults that they had heaped upon our countrymen in Berlin. We have kept our vow, and we will now retire." Nothing could equal the bitter hatred which existed, and still exists, between the French and the Prussians. End of Section 7. Recording by Ruth Golding.